Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight's story topic of Haunted Woods is courtesy of Christy, using her power token to select a topic for every month. If you'd like to find out how you can obtain some, you can click the link in the description to check out Patreon and receive other rewards like the ones you see on screen. Thank you, Christy. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable. Grab your flashlights and let the darkness take control. I've always lived in the countryside, and still do. When I was younger, me and my two sisters would often play in the woods behind our house. We had this huge area to roam around in, and as we lived very isolated, we'd never seen anyone there before but us. This meant we could roam around to our heart's content, build forts, biking trails, whatever we wanted. This was our nature playground. Our parents would always be able to shout and we'd come, as we'd never venture far, although these woods did extend very far indeed. There were a few occasions when we thought we would hike deeper to see what we would find, but for the most part, all that we would encounter would be more and more trees. However, one time, my sister opted for us to go a different route, sort of to the left of where our house was. We filled up our bags with snacks and water and went on our way. That's when we made it to a seemingly forgotten graveyard. This graveyard was nestled in the woods. Any fences that had been there had long eroded away or collapsed, maybe even the metal stolen. But the graves were there and visible, some completely covered in ivy and other plant life. We started looking around, taking the plants off some of the graves, seeing if it were possible to read any of the names. Most of them we couldn't make out, not even the dates, but a few which I can no longer remember were still barely legible. My sister had an idea that if we got some crayons and some paper, we might be able to trace the names, but we never did. However, after going to that part of the woods, did strange things start to happen. Now, remember, as I said, this was a very, very isolated place, and we'd never seen anyone here before. We'd start going out, doing our regular stuff, like go to our bike trail, and someone would have knocked over all of our cones. That'd be strange. My sisters just assumed it was the wind. On another occasion, our fort, which we had taken years building up, made of sticks and stuff, had been completely destroyed. All the sticks pulled apart and left on a pile on the floor. We couldn't explain this one away. My dad had been angry with us for staying out far too late in the forest, and so we went in to confront him about it, accusing him of doing this. He gave us a quizzical look and said he didn't even know where our fort was, and resumed working in his office. This freaked us out. But we tried to put it to the back of our minds and saw this as an opportunity to try and build the fort again. That's when things escalated. It was summer, and so we were usually out back playing until the sun was going down. As we were walking home one night, with about 3 minutes until we reached our back door, did we hear footsteps behind us. All three of us instantly turn around. This is the first time we've ever heard anyone here before other than us. And we look. There's no one. We carry on walking, and about 15 seconds later, the footsteps resume, but they're at the same distance that they were before. We turn around. No one's there. And then, when we look forward back to our house, do we instantly see an apparition. the figure of a young girl. She was transparent and skipped away through the woods. Our eyes all tried to follow her movements, but she passed a tree and could not be seen again. She never emerged past it. We all screamed and ran all the way home. All of us were babbling to my mother about what we had seen, and she wasn't able to calm us down for about 20 minutes or get words out of us as to what we saw. When we finally were able to explain, each of us told our account that we had seen a girl skipping in the forest and that she went behind a tree and disappeared. One of my sisters even said that as we were running, she looked at the tree that she'd skipped past and that she definitely wasn't there. We were all in meltdown mode. My mother, bless her, tried her best to convince us that she believed us, but I know deep down she didn't. I only, in later life, realized why we may have seen what we did. Could it have been that we disturbed her grave? Or by visiting the grave, had we encouraged her to come out and play? We didn't go out for the rest of the summer. We played indoors and in the garden. But after winter, and when spring rolled around, did we start braving the woods again. We never saw an apparition like that again, but it wouldn't be uncommon for us to hear things while playing. Probably the scariest, besides the apparition of course, was the time that we heard laughter coming from all around us, seemingly every direction of the forest infested by this childish giggling, which caused us to run home. Knowing our parents didn't believe, we simply didn't tell them about it. We're all grown up now, but when the three of us meet up, we often talk about our experiences growing up and contemplate what it could have been that was haunting our forest. A little girl or something more sinister. We may never know, but that's good enough for me. When I went back to my parents' house, I took a walk through the woods, and it turns out the graveyard is still there. I mean, it wasn't going anywhere. But what I find most curious of all is that when I told my parents about it, they didn't even know it existed, and it had only been a 15-minute walk away from their property, at most. Creepy stuff. At the time of this story, I was going through a bad breakup. Turns out that one of my best friends had been having an affair with my now ex-girlfriend. If this has happened to anyone, you know the feeling of being crushed, not only by your partner, but by your closest and most trusted friend. I have always been a bit of a loner, and so the few friends I had I cherished, and this was a truly crushing blow for me. I sort of lost it for a while. I just kind of went off the radar, packed all my things quietly one evening, drove to my parents' house, and broke down. It wasn't a pretty sight. I don't know how she could have done that to me. But whatever, that's in the past now. In an attempt to heal my very breaking and aching heart, I started taking long walks at night. It would give me time to think and smoke and just generally chill. I found it very hard sleeping, my mind always racing. So instead of fighting a losing battle, I just wore myself to the point where I would pass out at about 4 a.m. It was better that way. But onto the story. There's these woods near my parents' house. As a kid, I never really went into them. Picked up some pretty creepy vibes from them before, but as an adult, with not much to lose, I felt like it was time to explore these creepy woods. And what better time than between 1 and 3 a.m, of course. I'd always have my phone on me as a flashlight, although the battery did drain quite quickly. But there was usually enough moonlight out so that I would be able to see my way through the woods. The canopy was by no means thick, and with the streetlights dotted about in the distance, you could just about make out this trail. I'd been walking through the woods for about a month now, starting to feel better about my situation and coming to terms with the fact that an 8-year relationship had come to an end, and that there are far better ways to spend my time than moping about all of this. That's when, for the first time ever, I heard something. It sounded like footsteps. This was odd. After about a month of walking in the woods, I had never heard a single soul behind me this late at night. Chills ran down my spine, and something inside me told me that I didn't want to be seen. So I quietly turned off my flashlight and crept behind a tree. I sat down and listened. At first, the sound was muffled, but as it came closer, it was very clearly boots stomping their way forward, almost like a march. I peeked from my position on the tree, and what I saw gave me chills. There was a figure. They were wearing revolutionary-style clothes, and they just marched on, kind of illuminated by the moonlight, but definitely translucent. My eyes followed the grey spectral figure as it walked through the woods. It got to a point where it simply vanished. In the films, they make it that they become puffs of smoke or stuff like that, but this was not the case. The spectre was there 1 second, and then simply was not the next. Now, as someone who had been walking this trail for a month, and who genuinely couldn't sleep, I can assure you all I was not fatigued in imagining this. If anything, the adrenaline surging through me had caused me to become more awake than I had ever been, on one of these walks anyway. And I sat there, waiting for about 20 minutes in case the figure showed up again. I slowly brushed the dead leaves off my butt and strode onwards towards the house. I got back home, and now my mind was plagued with other thoughts. What the hell did I just see? I didn't sleep that night, and the next night, for the first time ever, I managed to get a good night's rest, as things had been put into perspective a little bit more. I'm almost grateful. Seeing that figure helped me get over a bad breakup. So, to the ghost who I saw that night, if you're out there, thank you for your service. After my family moved from South Mississippi, we spent maybe 6 months outside Batesville, but we moved to a city just outside of Charlotte. The house we bought, my parents purchased for probably one of the oddest reasons ever. The day we toured the home, the elderly lady that owned it was cooking pasta, and the house had filled with the smell of good homemade tomato sauce. My parents fell in love at that very instant. The house wasn't what you'd consider to be large, being one of those ranch-style homes that was popular in the 70s and 80s. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a concrete back patio, half a dozen pine trees of varying age, and a carport rounded out the home. The house itself was sat on maybe a 1/4 acre of land, kind of on a hill, with a crawl space. First things first, before we go any further, I have done some research into the property. Naturally, as I was 12 at the time and there was no internet, I didn't do it then. But when I started getting into paranormal investigations, I felt that it was a good time as any to look into some of the previous properties where I had experiences. As far as I can tell, the house itself had nothing overly spectacular that happened in it. while the property itself had been part of a subdivision that grew up there in a housing boom in the 70s, while the majority of the houses dated from around that era. There were one or two which were younger, and maybe a handful that were older. The only thing of note, even marginally so, was records of a Civil War Confederate army that passed through the area, but no real major battles there, perhaps a skirmish or two, but nothing substantial. Whatever the case, I couldn't tie any actual deaths to the property itself. Note, I mean the property the house stood on, not the subdivision. That's another story, but I'll get to that presently. When we first moved to the house, it didn't take long to notice some strangeness to it. Feelings of being watched were common, if not regular. There always seemed to be a presence, and one that didn't strike me as being very happy, tied to the living room area. Curiously, my parents would close the hallway door, which opened into the foyer and front door, each and every night. That wasn't something they did previously, as any other house that had a similar setup. I never did figure out why they did that though. Whatever the case, the feeling of being watched seemed to all center around the living room and the foyer area of the house. My first bedroom was directly adjacent to this, and I started sleeping with my own door closed then. I can't count how many times I would wake at night with the distinct feeling that something was watching me as I slept. Something that didn't want me or my family there. As far as I can remember though, I only ever had one full paranormal sighting, which is to say, I saw something that I can't explain. One Saturday morning while my dad was outside working on his truck in the patio, I sat in front of the TV in the living room watching my cartoons. As I sat there for some unknown reason, I look up at the door that connected to the hallway. I think I heard someone walking past, or maybe sensed something. In either case, as I looked up for a moment, I caught the shape of someone walking past the door. I didn't see a full body, but rather a hand in a long jacket with large brass buttons. It was as though someone was swinging their arms as they were walking, and their hand had remained visible for an instant before they walked into the hallway. The hand did not look normal though. Everything was grey. This soft, faded grey that you could kind of see through. Needless to say, I freaked out. I stood up, and without sparing a glance back, I darted off into the carport. My father asked me what happened, and I told him I'd seen someone, or thought I had seen someone walking down the hall. He gave me a funny look, checked the house, and told me to change and go out to play, as it was obvious to him that I'd been inside for far too long. The feelings of being watched never really stopped in the house. They kind of came and went after that, but the overall feeling that I got was that something just wasn't right about that place. Now, as I said, I can't tie anything to the house or property it was on itself, but the land the subdivision was on was another story. Further down from where I lived, there was this deep gully area with this old dirt road that ran into it, and then alongside the creek at the bottom. This area was rather popular among the few kids that lived in the area, with us cutting trails and building forts. One thing that always stood out about this area was at the bottom of the gully, the rusted remains of a wrecked car sat half in the gully and half out. I now know that it was a 1940s era car, but at the same time all I knew was that it was old, and it had been there a while. This car was something weird in its own right. Every kid that lived in the area had stories about it, with the majority of them being that they didn't like standing near it. Where possible, they'd even go out of their way to avoid being close to it. Much like my house, things didn't really feel right there. But at the car wreck site, well, that feeling was jacked up to 11. Everyone had stories of seeing things in those trails too. With my then best friends, Rob and Riley, relating a story of how one day they were chased out of the trails by this weird old guy in overalls, carrying a pipe or something similar. They told me they saw the guy running after them, and once they passed the car, Rob looked back to see this old guy vanish into thin air. Other friends told of this weird girl in an old dress who would sometimes be seen walking along the trails like she was lost. When approached, she would just silently stare at someone before turning and walking deeper into the woods. Those that tried to follow her would end up turned around and usually pop out the trails back where they had started. So naturally, when I started researching my old home, I had to look into the old gully as well. While I didn't find anything substantial that would say, "Yup, this place is haunted, and here's why," I did turn up a good bit of circumstantial evidence. As with everything, you have to take evidence, especially circumstantial, with a grain of salt. But I do think that this answered some of the questions I had about the area. Granted, it still created more questions, but I'm at least happy with the results. As to the circumstantial evidence, I found that back in the 50s the property had been largely uninhabited. I say largely because there was something of an exception to this. On the backside of things, across from where the gully was, a house had stood. That home was owned by a family who had owned the property that would later become the subdivision. Most of where the subdivision was had been farmland, while the dirt road followed the curve of the road I lived on, before turning and going deeper into the gully area. The road has been cut at some prior point, possibly in the 30s or so, to act as an access road to allow loggers to cull some of the pine trees in the area. However, by the 50s, it was largely out of use, save for a kind of make-out place by local kids. The area being well enough out of the city limits and quiet enough so people wouldn't be disturbed. Sometime around 1956 or 7, the house that owned the property burnt down under mysterious circumstances, killing the elderly man who owned the property. The cause of the fire had been arson, though they were never able to figure out who had done it. It is believed, however, that the fire had been started in retaliation for something that had happened a couple of years earlier. Several years earlier, the man who owned the property had found himself in court as a result of some actions he had taken. The record was rather vague on this, but it did note that in trying to scare some kids off his property, there had been an accident that resulted in the death of one young woman. Beyond that, it didn't say much. Whatever the case, the man managed to beat it and returned to his home. Then a few years later, his home burnt down with him inside it. After that, the property remained forgotten, ended up being broken up by several purchases before sometime in the 70s, a development company purchased it and started putting homes on it. What do I think happened there? I've got a couple of theories, but based on everything I remember seeing and knowing of the area, only one thing seems to be likely. Sometime between 1950 and 1955, this man's property became a popular make-out place for local teens. This angers the man as the kids are making a nuisance of themselves, vandalizing his property and outbuildings, and just generally annoying him. So one night he takes things into his own hands. The cops really aren't doing much as he's outside the city limits and deputies are taking forever to show up when they show. So he decides that he's going to either confront the kids or at the very least give them a good scare. He happens upon some kids and starts chasing them in hopes of getting them off his property, when the driver makes a mistake and either hits a tree or simply rolls his car into the gully. This then kills the girl in the car, injures the boy, and causes the man to be charged with being responsible for their deaths. However, he manages to beat the charge, with the death being ruled accidental, and he's not held responsible. The car remains where it's wrecked, due to it being either too difficult to pull out or just not worth the trouble to recover. Someone tied to the kids, possibly the parents, or the surviving kid himself takes the law into his own hands and sets the man's house on fire, killing him in the process. The police are pretty much tired of dealing with this guy, or just don't look into it too hard, and the killer goes unpunished. I think the theory pretty well explains, at the very least, the experiences we often had on those trails, with Rob and Riley being chased off by the old man's ghost, repeating the same kind of thing he had been known for doing. The girl, on the other hand, was likely the spirit of the one killed in the accident. She may have been cursed to wander simply because the killer was never convicted. Whatever the case, the property is pretty much now gone. Since we lived there in 1986 to 89, the area has been built up further, with the gully area largely being filled in and developed into housing. I do wonder if the people that lived there see the spirits from time to time, but I don't have any real way to contact them without looking like some kind of crazy person. Well, now that I live over 3,000 miles away. In the end, I suppose, this is one of those ghost stories that doesn't really have a good ending, or ever will. Oh, and as to the Batesville thing, well, Batesville Elementary/High School used to be well known for a haunting in the gymnasium. The ghost in question was a young girl who was brutally assaulted and eventually killed there, with the case still open as her killer was never caught. It was said that from time to time, people would hear the sound of a girl screaming for help in the back corner of the gym near the bleachers. On inspection though, they wouldn't find anyone. I didn't ever experience the ghost myself, though as the murder happened about a year after my family moved. However, I am kind of tied to the story indirectly. The girl who was murdered, her mother was a teacher who worked with my mum, who was also a teacher. That girl also had a crush on me. So yeah, I knew her. Always kind of felt bad that I rebuffed her advances so much. But I thought she was a bit weird and just didn't like her. So that's that. I have had several paranormal experiences in my life, and I consider myself somewhat sensitive to them. These experiences have sort of fallen on my lap, and I have never been one to search for anything beyond our current understanding of the world. My first incident happened when I was a kid. I was always a heavy sleeper, and would sleep through the night like a rock, even through some of the worst thunderstorms. One night, however, I awoke in the middle of the night, wide awake. I look around, and in my room there is a soft yellow glow of my Batman nightlight peering through my bunk bed ladder. I look to the right and remember seeing the closet door open, and I always kept it shut, and a cobra-looking snake off to the side of the middle of the floor. I leaned up and sat on my bed fixated on it, but then remembered what it was. It was my toy set, and I could start to see the mountain that was made to resemble a snake. Once I caught a glimpse of my own trickery, I felt a looming presence beneath me. I had an odd sensation stream through me that there was something under my bed, so I became frightened and did what any rational kid would do in this situation. I crept closer to my nightlight, like the light would save me from whatever was underneath me. And as I moved closer, there was something inside of me that kept saying, "Look underneath, look underneath." I inched myself over the edge, and as I came close to the precipice of seeing underneath, I heard the most demonic, menacing growl I've ever heard still to this day. I shot back as quick as a spooked shrimp and shielded myself with my blanket. Petrified, I started rationalizing everything. "Joey, is that you?" I said this shakily, hoping it was my uncle who loved to pick on me. "Joey?" I chimed again, hoping it was him. The same indistinct feeling told me to look over the bed. "Look behind you." I peered the blanket over my head, looked behind me, and saw a ghoulish hand creep over the back end of my bed. Then everything went black. The house I primarily grew up in was built by us and for us on what was rumored to be a Native American lookout, which I came to find out through my dad later in life. Just a few miles away from the mound builders in Heath, Ohio, USA. All of my events in that house would come and go with streaks of consistency to long periods of nothing. But when something happened, you knew it was happening. I slept with a light on in my room until I had my own TV. But the next time anything off happened to me, I was in middle school. Right around the age of "you're old enough to be home alone," and during this time I saw a lot of death in my family, and my parents were going through the later stages before their divorce. I'd had odd dreams and reoccurring nightmares every once in a while about my basement, but I chalked it off to, oh, it's a basement and they're supposed to be inherently creepy, so I thought nothing of it. Every once in a while, I'd be home in my room, and my sister, who is my only other sibling, would be off at a friend's or doing sports. I'd hear the garage door open and think, oh, Dad's home, and continued playing my game. Then I'd leave my sanctuary to go get food or water, and hear the TV downstairs playing Star Wars and the sounds of toys being boxed and taped up. My dad and I were in the collectible toy business before it hit its most recent downfall as of here recently. I'd open the basement door and see if he needed a hand, and as I'd open the door, all the sounds dissipate, and all I see is black down the steps. I'd check the garage to see if anyone even came home, to find it empty. I'd find out later the same thing would happen to my sister and even my dad. The same thing, but vice versa. If I was downstairs, garage noises would happen. I'd hear the sounds of my mum's van, her footsteps, and the jingle of her keys, only to go upstairs to an empty house. My mum, Catholic raised, was the only one in the house to never openly admit to seeing or hearing anything. My dad, who's a little more out there, would have the noise experiences, chronologically to this story, and he told me of the time that our dog Lola stared into my sister and I's part of the house/bathroom. She apparently was growling and barking in that direction for about half an hour, until he decided to get out of the kitchen to look. He saw nothing, but as he got closer, Lola immediately stopped barking, as if he scared whatever it was away. My sister would always feel uncomfortable in the house, and especially in her room. Her room would always be the coldest in the entire house, which made little sense because her room faced the southern sky with no cover from the sun unless it was a cloudy day. She told me that around the age of the aforementioned night, she'd feel like something weird was happening in my room and would see a strange green glow. The next time anything weird happened, besides the noises and dreams, I would be in high school at this point. My mum had claimed a glass cabinet with a mirror on the inside from my great-grandma, who was dear to us. However, the cabinet didn't feel dear and was stuck in the basement. I would spend most of my time downstairs and have my own setup because my friends came over a lot. This was the time of the 360, and Rock Band was a hit. I would sing and play the guitar, and it was a blast. One day, I was jamming. I felt a weird chill go down my spine. Something was in the corner of the room where the cabinet was. I paused the game, looked out of the corner of my eye, The cabinet at this point was about 6 feet away from me. As I looked, I saw my reflection twist its head with a menacing smile and start to twist out the chair and creep closer. I dropped the plastic guitar, ran upstairs and out the back door. I waited until my mum got home before I went back inside. A few months passed before I felt safe to be downstairs alone, and eventually things evened out, but still to this day I don't trust the cabinet. The next things I would encounter after the cabinet became more absurd and extraterrestrial, although while that was going on, there was a white house 2 houses down to the left that kept giving me ominous vibes. Dawes Arboretum eventually bought the property, and here recently demolished the house. I think it's also a good time to mention that the road I live on has had 5 tragedies of people taking their own lives, and the church on the road has always been rumoured to be a front for satanic worship. Also, the Boeing company has a high security facility not 10 minutes away from my house. The company works with the Air Force and makes equipment for them. I know this is about to get bizarre, and it's getting to a point of, this guy's a quack, but I have nothing to gain from sharing this besides a sound mind. My girlfriend at the time and I would spend a lot of time together. We were each other's rocks, and had all the makings of high school sweethearts. One night after drama practice, she drove me home as she normally did, as I did not have a car. We made our way up the hill to my house, and waited for my mum who was running late. It was tax season, and that's her job. Eventually we heard the garage door open, and looked to the left to see a car coming up the driveway over the first hill. My driveway is easily 400 meters long, and from Google Maps, they made it its own road. Once you go past that first hill, there's no real going back. I grabbed my things, kissed her goodbye, and looked to the garage to see the door was still closed. "What? That's weird," my girlfriend said. We then looked down my driveway, and didn't see the car lights anymore, nor their rear lights. Then out of nowhere, her car shuts off. Lights, engine, everything. No key turn, no emergency lights. It's like the entire car was drained of everything. She called her dad to have him come and see what was wrong, because her dad is a mechanic. My mum finally made her way home, and the moment she opened the garage door, my girlfriend's car started up again. A week later, my girlfriend was over, and my mum had to go to the store and get groceries. My dogs, Max and Lily, began barking and going crazy. Then, there was a weird humming noise going through the house, and you can feel the vibrations through it as well. Now my house is surrounded by corn and soybean fields. I checked outside through the window to see no farming equipment, but 3 evenly parallel dots above the tree line to the west of the house. They blinked 3 times and everything stopped. The noise, the vibration, the dogs, all of it. Then after a good amount of time, I went to Hocking College, and my girlfriend went to OU. If anyone knows anything about the hills and Athens, they're supposed to be haunted as hell. One day while I was visiting her, she had to grab something from one of her friends in a separate dorm. We get ready and travel over. I walk to the dorm and start to not be able to breathe, like it's restrained, not entirely suffocating but close. As we go up the steps, my neck starts to feel tight, and I tell her what's going on, to which she replies, "Oh, a kid hung himself and ended his own life there 3 days ago." As with the rest of my stories, I immediately leave the building and wait for her outside the dorm. A good while would pass before my next event took place. I woke up late for my culinary practice exam. When it got foggy in the hills, it got foggy. but this fog was so thick that I could barely see in front of me. I walked to my class because I still lacked a car. I was also in the classic, I don't know my religion phase in college at the time, so I was meandering my way through the fog when I heard the sound of two birds and could see their tiny black silhouettes through the fog. I followed them as they led me through the path to the culinary building. But when I got there, they perched themselves upon the top and looked at me. I knew what they were and who sent them, Hugging and Munnin, and Odin was watching me, which transformed my religious standpoint. Later in my years at college on my 21st birthday, I woke up in the middle of the night with sleep paralysis. The apartment that my ex and I had a light that would gleam through our window. This night, the soft light changed to an off-red. To the left of me, down a ways, was where our washer and dryer were, but the entire area was pitch black. I could feel a presence there that was definitely malicious, and not okay, just gleaming at me and smiling. The next day, I woke up and told my ex all about it. We had plans to go to Columbus to an Irish bar called Fado for my first legal Guinness. I ended up getting sick out of the blue halfway through our trip, and we ended up just going back home and continuing my days sick. My other Athens experience was when I went to the infamous Ridges. At this point in my life, my ex and I broke up, and I was on a wave of self-destructive behaviors. My friends from college were still in and going, and I was out and free. I dropped by every so often, and on this occasion we decided to go at a night and walk through Ridges. The majority of the group was the typical, let's get high and walk through the woods, but Mary and I never danced to the same beat, so I refrained. Our objective was the unmarked gravesite near the new compost building. We made our trek there A-OK, nothing odd or weird. The moment we got to the graves, things changed for me. They were hanging around, taunting the area, saying hi to spirits, and they started their dance with Mary. Then I heard, "Hey, get off," come from the woods near us to the left. I asked them if they heard that. They claimed that I was just trying to mess with them. I looked over at the group, and one of them was standing on a tombstone that lay flat on the ground, so I quickly told them to get off and scolded them. As our time there grew, my feeling of uneasiness did as well, and I was able to eventually get everyone to head back. When we were heading back, I started to see a woman in white gowns shift and dissipate between the gaps in the trees. I started booking it out of there, and eventually we all headed back. If anyone who's hearing this has ever been to Nelsonville, Ohio for any reason, you'd know it as a one-horse town with a giant cross on a hill. The town has become primarily dry because the 2 to 3 churches in the town have almost all purchased the available liquor licenses for the town. But there is a bar that still stands today that holds ties with the true history of the town, and it's called The Mine, right next to the Rhapsody, which I spent a lot of time working for, not only class but being paid. One night at the mine, 2 of my friends and I were out back on their patio having a drink. This random woman came and sat down at our table out of the blue. "You guys are young. I'm a psychic, and if you'd like, I could give you all a free reading." Obviously curious, we all accepted. My old friend since kindergarten went first. "I see an odd change happening soon. Your mischievous spirit will help guide you, but your nomadic ways could get in the way. You're going to get an opportunity soon in love that you have to take." This hit the nail on the head, but we were all weary because of the people reading and vagueness that gets referred to psychics. My second friend was next. "You're broken, not your body but your heart. There's a loved one who left and doesn't feel the same. What's her name? My friend replied the name. Oh, she's going through transformations right now and will eventually settle down, but there's someone else. I'm sorry. This was also spot on, but also very, very vague. Then it was my turn. She helps my hand, and her face went into a confused contortion. You're strong, not physically but spiritually. There's an old love, but it's a dying flame. You're going to see a lot of battles ahead of you, sword and shield. And then she let go of my hand and shook her head and said, I don't trust you. She stood up and walked away. We never saw her again from any of our recurring visits to mine. A good amount of time would pass until my next experience. At this point in my life, I stayed more at home and went to my friend's apartment, which eventually would become my own. We'd be outside on the back patio and engage in the most binge-drinking game of them all, Ring of Fire. Towards the beginning of the fall, my two friends living there started feeling something else in the house with them. On one of the nights, I saw a little boy with dark hair running through the kitchen out of the corner of my eye from outside, and we all heard a door slam in the apartment. I stopped what I was doing to investigate. The front door was locked and no one else was home, but the basement door had been closed and was opened. The airflow of this apartment is always shaky and closing open doors all the time. I brushed off the closed basement door, but still felt like I needed to check it out. I went downstairs and turned on all the lights, and was looking around and trying to see what was up. Then I became fixated on this old nutcracker that the third roommate had. It just seemed different than all the other ones she had standing in rows downstairs. However, by the time she packed all her things up and I moved in, the little boy and the feeling of something there went away with her. The last experience I've had happened more recently and about a month ago. The place I work at is the Granville Inn right across the street from the Buxton Witch, which is presumably really haunted. However, our building is supposedly haunted as well. Old buildings tend to have the trend of old bones and memories. It was at the end of the month, and in my line of work that means inventory time. At the basement level, we have a room called the Whales Room, which is a place for private events. The room is notorious for flashing light bulbs and for the bulbs to die quickly. This could be just bad wiring from the rushed renovations the building experienced recently. I needed to inventory our personal logo water bottle storage right outside the exit doors through the room. Immediately I felt a cold chill behind me and looked into an open door that led to an abandoned storage room. Inside the room was a mirror propped into a corner facing the opening. Through my experience with mirrors, I quickly counted the water bottles and got the hell out of that area, and her eyes lit up. Apparently, one of our old FOH managers saw a man with an old-time outfit and hat walking down the hall to the Whales Room. Thinking it was a lost guest, he followed the man around the corner to find out he wasn't there, nor was there any sign or noise of anyone leaving through any of the doors. I hope my encounters have struck some sort of interest with you all. Like I said earlier, it's just so that I feel more sound and to put it out there. Thank you for your time. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's story topics, certainly a creepy one at that. I always love a good wood stories, but this is the first time we've ever had exclusively paranormal wood stories, which makes this video even cooler. in my opinion anyway. If you're interested in selecting video topics, you can get your own power token by signing up on Patreon. You get the power to pick any topic you want, within reason of course, and yeah, it's pretty fun. Why not join our Discord server, by the way, if you haven't already? You don't need to be on Patreon to do that, but it's just a fun place where me and a bunch of other subscribers all interact and chat. So if that's something you like, there is a link to that too in the description as well. So yeah, that'll be pretty awesome to keep the community really growing and interacting. And if you haven't checked out my pop bass either, that's something that is really, really cool, and I would highly recommend checking out. I put content on there and I think you guys would like it. So yeah, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to let me know. If there's a story that you would like to share for a future installment, feel free to send it to my email or my Reddit, but please include plenty of punctuation, good paragraphing and description for the maximum chance of your story being selected. But for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.